Talk Time today, and it's very exciting for me to be here on Talk Time today. I'm here with Dr. Frank Amthor, and we're going to be talking about neuroscience, and neurobiology. He's the author of two books, both of for dummy books, Neuroscience for Dummy and Neurobiology for Dummies. And I certainly consider myself in that group, so it's perfect to be able to talk with you, Dr. Amthor, and maybe just take a minute and introduce yourself. What would you like people to know about you?
Okay, well, I'm fundamentally a retinal researcher, and I'm trying to understand how our eyes work and what sort of messages the eyes send to the brain across the many pathways that they send those messages, and what can go wrong with the different classes of cells and various eye diseases, and then finally what we can do about it when things do go wrong, and that gets into the realm of brain-computer interfaces and retinal prostheses. In the visual system, we're way behind the auditory system. The cochlear implants have been installed in probably 100,000 people worldwide, and they've transformed hearing in people who were totally deaf to very functional hearing. But we're nowhere near doing that for vision because the system is so much more complicated and the interface is more difficult. So I'm not the only one working on this, but many of us are trying to move in that direction.
So that speaks a little bit to what we see in the background behind you in the way of your lab and some of the equipment, I guess, that you have there.
Yes, I'm a retinal electrophysiologist, so I record from various classes of ganglion cells in order to understand how they work. The optic nerve that comes out of the eye has about 1 million axons in it, and there are about 25 classes of ganglion cells that go to about 15 different retinal recipient zones in the brain, and these mediate various kinds of perception like color and the detection of motion and edges and so forth. And we're just beginning to get a good understanding of what those major pathways are and which ones might be most affected in diseases like glaucoma and so forth. But there's much more work to be done, and it's very technically challenging work. I was originally an electrical engineer as an undergraduate, and I went from that to artificial intelligence to neuroscience, and so I like the technical challenge of doing vision research.
Yeah, you started out as an electrical engineer, and now I guess you're looking at the electricity in the brain and how those connections are made in a real layman's terms, I guess.
That's exactly right. The neurons are electrical signaling devices. They use biochemistry to generate electricity, but fundamentally they operate as electrical devices. So when I started doing this, it was very obvious to all of us that the computer that's between our ears could outperform in many tasks any computer that we'd been able to build at that time. And so it seemed very logical for an electrical engineer to understand neural circuitry, not only to try to understand the brain, but perhaps to make better computers also.
So that kind of ties directly into maybe a little bit how you got started. I'm not sure, but what some of what the book addresses in the neurobiology for dummies about the nervous system and how our brain interfaces with the nervous system, and how it's similar to other animals. And maybe you could address that just for a moment.
Well, what I try to do in the books is to make the operation of the brain as understandable as possible, given what we know about the brain. There are a lot of books, for example, that will go over the anatomy of the brain, and you have all these complicated Latin names for various structures. but it's really hard to fit it together into a picture of how the brain operates and how we could interface external devices to the brain to ameliorate various kinds of brain damage or Alzheimer's or visual loss or those kinds of things. So, hopefully the books are helpful in giving people an introduction to the brain in a way that it's sort of understandable in general principles in terms of what the major areas are and what they do and what's going to go wrong if those areas are damaged by injury or various kinds of diseases.
So many of us are therapists, or some people who will also be viewers, also just interested in self-help kinds of things and learning more about psychology. And you do cover in the book like perception and how we think and how we learn and how we remember. So those are huge, whole big topics, each and one of their own. But what is something that you found really fascinating about the ways that we learn?
Well, I think one of the things that's really revolutionized the field of neuroscience in the last few years is that we used to think that more or less all the neurons you were going to have for your entire life were there by about a year of age. And then during learning, the synaptic weights might change, but you really didn't have any new birth of neurons in the adult brain. It turns out that that's not true. In a number of places, particularly the hippocampus, which is involved in learning and memory, new neurons are born all the time. And in some clinical cases, like depression, for example, there may be a suppression of the birth of new neurons. And this may interfere with your ability to cope with new environments and so forth. So this has been a very exciting avenue of research for people working on learning and memory and various kinds of psychological disorders to realize that there are important organic brain changes going on. We also know that the brain is subject to the same circulatory problems that the rest of the body has, and if you have diabetes or other conditions that compromise the circulatory system, they begin to compromise the brain. And so one of the lessons for that is, take care of your body and you're taking care of your brain also, and your brain will last longer, and those new neurons will get born as you need them if your circulation is good, and all those kinds of things. So I think that development has been very exciting recently.
That really is exciting, thinking about circulation in the brain. It reminds me of a couple of years ago, the study was coming out or being talked about with Alzheimer's and laser treatment as a possibility. That study that was being done on rats, I don't know whatever happened to that, but it had to do too with clearing out the circuits, I guess, from what would happen in the Alzheimer's.
There have been some interesting research findings about the effect of infrared light on the nervous system, and in a number of cases, infrared light seems to have a protective and possibly even healing function, and the function is different in different systems. Alzheimer's is difficult because we don't really have a good way of detecting it other than when the person's reached the point where they're clearly losing their memory, and they've reached the point where there are such large-scale neuronal death going on in the brain that it can be seen in a brain scan. And it's important to detect it early because there are behavioral and other kinds of ways of coping with the problems that are going to occur if we knew they were coming. So I think research is very exciting in that area in trying to understand the mechanisms of Alzheimer's and their progression, and various techniques for trying to ameliorate the effects as they occur. But I think we're still in pretty early stages. But it's a huge problem because we're all living longer now, and the longer you live, the more likely it is that you will start getting Alzheimer's kinds of symptoms. And so it's as civilization advances, it's a bigger and bigger problem for all of us all the time.
All the more reason to keep doing those push-ups, I guess, keep that circulation going up.
Exercise really helps, yes.
So let's step back to a minute. I got sidetracked off on the Alzheimer's, but you were talking about some of these exciting developments in learning, research around learning, about that we do continue to either block or create new neural pathways. And maybe I could just ask you a little personal question is, what has all of your knowledge and application of this neuroscience, how has it impacted you personally? Any things that you put into place that you found important based on what you know, what you've been learning about the brain?
That's an interesting question. In just the last year or two, I've really begun to think that a retinal prosthesis is a real possibility in the next 5 to 10 years. And I've started working on, with other people, of course, various ways of injecting a signal into the optical pathways. There are two major kinds of retinal disease, one of which is in things like macular degeneration and retinitis pigmentosa. The photoreceptors die, and so you don't have any light response in the retina. But the retinal ganglion cells, which are the cells that I've been studying all of my life, they continue to exist. And the possibility there is of supplying an external signal that from a camera that would sense the light and injecting that signal into the retinal ganglion cells. And there are various ways of doing that. It could be done electrically, it could be done pharmacologically. There's a real revolution in what's called optogenetics, in getting neurons to express ion channels that are sensitive to light. People have also been looking at the fact that ultrasound can stimulate neurons. So there are all these techniques out there now by which you could inject a signal into the nervous system to try to replace the lost signal that occurs when things like photoreceptors die. So I'm really beginning to orient my work in a more applied kind of direction, as opposed to, out of the 25 major classes, we pretty much know what 20 of them are, finding the other 5 and understanding them. So that's been a big change in my thinking.
That's really fascinating. So if we brought that down, that application to the photoreceptors that you're talking about, what's symptoms of that when that decay starts to happen?
In retinitis pigmentosa, the initial symptom is always night blindness, because the rods that mediate dim vision die off first. And then when they die off, the cones which mediate day vision start dying off from the periphery into the middle, and so you end up with tunnel vision. You're like you were looking through a cardboard tube. And then finally, in the last stages of progression, all vision is lost. So night vision tends to be the first to go. In macular degeneration, areas of the retina which are irregular and vary from patient to patient tend to die off in the middle. So it's kind of the opposite. You lose central vision, but you may have some peripheral vision. In both those cases, it's photoreceptor death that's occurring, and obviously the best thing to do would be to stop that to begin with, but there are, of course, already people who've lost all their photoreceptors and they don't regenerate, and we don't know how to make them artificially regenerate. So if we could use a mechanical means like the cochlear prosthesis in the visual system to restore some vision, that would be, an important goal to help those people.
Okay, so I'm trying to digest all of that. That's really exciting. I'm thinking, now, knowing nothing about either one of those diseases, I guess, are those old age kinds of things that occur, or are they in relation to other diseases that people get? Like, I think I know with diabetes, there can be blindness with some other diseases.
Uh-huh. Both retinitis pigmentosa and macular degeneration are hereditary diseases. In retinitis pigmentosa, the heredity is actually pretty well understood. Usually, the degeneration doesn't start until adulthood. In macular degeneration, there's a wet form and a dry form. The dry form is clearly associated with aging. And it just seems to be there's an accumulation of damage, and ultimately there's degeneration of the photoreceptors and maybe the pigment epithelium. Diabetic retinopathy that you mentioned also, you have vascular problems like you have in the rest of the body, and the vascular problems kill cells in the retina, and the photoreceptors seem to be the most susceptible to any sort of injury. So they start dying off, and so you have the same sort of progression again. So there are multiple insults that occur in the retina. The one that's really different that I haven't mentioned is glaucoma, and that actually affects the retinal ganglion cells, which are the output of the retina. And that is associated with high intraocular pressure. That's also hereditary. It tends to occur in young adulthood. For that, we would have to put the retinal prosthesis actually in the brain, in visual cortex, because after the ganglion cells are gone, there's no signal that we can inject there. So different kinds of blindness would require different kinds of technological solutions.
So none of the ones that you're talking about are going to help me with my, like being able to take off my glasses or take out contacts, or you for that matter, I guess, huh?
Well, that's a front of the eye problem, and as we all get into our 40s, our lens in our eyes starts getting stiffer, and it doesn't want to bulge anymore to allow us to see things that are close up. So, maybe someone will invent a pair of glasses that can tell where you're looking and automatically adjust the focus. That's probably an easier problem to do. It's actually a little surprising that such things don't exist. I actually wondered at some point with the Google glasses if they couldn't actually implement that function, since they had some idea where the person was looking, but they didn't try to incorporate that idea there. I have the same problem that you do. I have, glasses of different powers scattered all over the place, or looking at computer screens, or looking at things that are really close, or cooking in the kitchen, or any of those things. I need a different pair of glasses for every one of those things, and it happens to all of us.
Yes, darn it. I know. Even those darn progressive lenses are really hard to use when you're going up and down stairs. So
yeah, it can make you dizzy.
Really tricky. So you're really working with the junctures that are much, like you said, the inside rather than the outside problem when you're beginning to look at those cells. And that sounds like a very exciting shift for you to be looking and working on those solutions, which sounds like a little bit of a different take for you. So in your general understanding about the brain and the classes that you teach, and of course the books that you've written, you've talked some about the circulatory system, taking good care of our body is going to make a big difference in our brain. Have those findings impacted you? Like, that you keep a good exercise regime, or like you do the crossword puzzles, or has that impacted you in some way, what you know about the brain?
Well, absolutely. So, as I've gotten older, I've gotten more conscious of controlling my sugar levels in my blood, and I have a blood glucose meter, and I've sort of reduced my sweets and carbs, and I've lost 10 pounds or so in the last couple of months, and I exercise pretty regularly, playing tennis. So I'm doing all of those things. Exercise, as it turns out, is very important in maintaining memory function and brain health. It's even apparently almost as good, I hate to say this to a therapist, but it works in a lot of cases almost as well as therapy in dealing with things like depression. So, exercise is a wonderful thing for adults, and people should continue exercising as long as they can.
Yeah, it's amazing how much it helps, and sometimes people just need the support to get out there and get moving, to have someone that's kind of encouraged them along the way. So yeah, I found that too, even in my practice, that if people can get out and get moving, it makes such a big difference in mood and emotional regulation, can really help. Of course, we've got to work on those thinking patterns too, we find, or they end up going back down. Somehow the surge from the exercise isn't enough to hold people if they have these really other kind of dysfunctional ways of maybe not even being kind to themselves in their internal lives. But it's great to hear that you've really taken these things to heart. I know you've been a tennis player for a long time, but it's great to hear about the other things you're doing.
One of the things that apparently has a major impact on brain health is actually learning a second language, and we can do that as adults. There are lots of things that you can do to generate brain function, and particularly novel brain function, and doing things that are different from anything that you've done before. So. We all need to watch a little less TV and be a little more active in doing things out there in the world, and reading, and all those kinds of things.
Well, I would love to learn how to learn a second language. My husband and I moved to Mexico about four years ago, thinking that if we were in the culture, we would be able to pick it up. But just being in the culture certainly is not enough to get it.
Well, you probably need to, find the right software, or do something with immersion for at least a couple of weeks, and everybody can do it. Just have to have a real go at it, I guess. But language is not the only thing. But doing something new that you haven't done before, it seems to really be helpful in keeping your brain active.
So new and novel is really important, and of course, language immersion makes much. It's not something you cannot focus on a lot and just pick up. At least for me, that's been really hard.
I think even things like volunteer work, where you're having to deal with different kinds of people in different ways than you've done before. I mean, even those kinds of things that sort of challenge you outside your comfort zone. I think all of those things are probably very helpful. And I bet, if we scanned people doing those things, we would see birth of new neurons going on in the hippocampus when people were operating outside their comfort zone a little bit. So it's good to challenge yourself and keep doing it.
What is it about the new and novel that helps the brain and helps its health?
Well, I think the idea is that when you do things that you've done a lot and that you're pretty familiar with, the brain routines tend to be automatic, and the procedures for doing those things are stored in brain circuits, which become very hardwired and almost unconscious, like riding a bicycle. You ride a bicycle all the time. You don't have to think about riding a bicycle anymore. And if you are only doing those kinds of things, you aren't creating new pathways that makes these new neurons get born and sort of rewires things that allows your brain to continue to grow. So you just don't want to get stuck in a situation where you're only doing the same things that you already know how to do over and over again. You just want to challenge yourself, and that's why things like a new language or doing anything else that's outside of your comfort zone, all of those things seem to help in that sense, in forcing you to think in somewhat different ways and so forth. If you're a conservative, read liberal stuff. If you're a liberal, read conservative stuff. Just get outside your comfort zone a little bit, and I think that keeps your brain functioning and growing.
Okay, I'm just going to pause a little bit because I'm getting some feedback from people that there must be some delay and we're talking over each other a little bit. So I'm going to recap a little just what you said about the stimulation of the newness. And I guess that's what it is. It is the stimulation that increases. Is that pragmatically, is that stimulation, like if you're conservative, read liberal, is new, different, intriguing? Is it from, like, does that newness increase blood flow, or what is it? Do we understand enough to know what it is about the novel that improves brain health?
I think we understand a little bit, and I think part of what we understand is in areas of the brain that are associated with learning, like the hippocampus. The hippocampus is capable of generating new wiring all the time, but it has to be challenged in order to do that. So when we're outside our comfort zone and we're trying to learn something new, I think it stimulates blood flow in the hippocampus and stimulates the formation of new synapses, and then ultimately the formation of new neurons. Just like growing a muscle, just think of your brain as a muscle. You exercise, the muscles get bigger. You exercise your brain, the neural pathways get bigger and more capable. It's really very similar in a lot of ways. That's, I think, the best metaphor that people could use for it. Use it or lose it.
That's really delightful. That's really delightful in the kind of the beautiful simplicity of it that can be created. So when you are working with the brain, and you're involved in some really interesting things with the eyes and the cells, we may have some folks who would be interested to know a little bit about how, this is basic, kind of pretty basic, how a brain cell differs from other cells in the body.
Okay, well, brain cells are cells, and they have all of the components that other cells have, like nuclei and various structures for metabolic functions like mitochondria. But what they're specialized for is electrical signaling. So neurons elaborate what are called dendrites, which are a tree-like structure in which they have receptors for neurotransmitters that come from other cells, and a typical neuron will have several thousand of these receptors, so other neurons talk to a given neuron through these receptors, and then the neuron has an output, which is its axon, and that goes out to several thousand other cells, and where it releases the neurotransmitters and stimulates them. So you have this complicated system of cells talking to each other, and some are active at some times and some are active at other times. In the retina where I work, some cells are excited by increases in light, some cells are excited by decreases in light, some cells like certain colors, some cells like motion in a certain direction, some cells like the presence of certain kinds of edges. And these go to brain circuits that allow you to see objects in motion and distinguish objects from their background by their color, and these kinds of things. So it's a big communication system that ultimately connects to your muscles and allows you to use your vision to move around and behave and recognize things and all of that. And it's true in all the different sensory systems, whether it's auditory or olfactory or whatever. You have some sensory input and processing, and a lot of neurons in the middle of the brain that are making decisions based on what's coming in, and then the behavior that you're trying to execute acted through the motor cortex and the motor neurons that allow you to move around and do things.
I love the idea about the cells getting excited about watching it, about you. I mean, I'm imagining you observing them and seeing this extra activity, this excitement that happens. And it makes me wonder, of course, because I'm not a neuroscientist and I'm a therapist, about are traumatic things do you also see excitement around traumatic kinds of things, or is that really a slowing down of that movement rather than an excitement?
Brain trauma can definitely cause neurons not only to be excited, but it can cause them to be so overexcited that a lot of them die. So, neurons are tightly constrained to release and to receive a certain amount of excitatory neurotransmitter, and if they're overstimulated, there can be essentially a catastrophe where some neurons release too much neurotransmitter, and that overexcites other neurons, and then they release too much, and you can actually have a lot of neurons die as a result of trauma. I mean, that's actually a very common result. And then, of course, after that, then you're missing a lot of neurons, and then the activity of that area is below normal because so many neurons have died. This typically happens in stroke and traumatic brain injury, but it could also happen in post-traumatic stress disorder and other kinds of things where you have pathways that are overstimulated for a while, and then you actually have neuronal loss, and then you have to cope with that afterwards.
That is so fascinating. That puts together some of what I see in the clinical office, and with PTSD especially. I'd never thought about it as this overstimulation, and then it's just too much for the circuitry to handle, and it kills those pathways off, or those neurons off, I guess. That is so fascinating to think about it in that kind of way, like overexcitement. Never would have occurred to me.
Mm-hmm. And then the brain tries to compensate for that, and sometimes the compensation is really kind of maladaptive because the circuit that's supposed to be there isn't there anymore. So, yeah, it's preventing, cell death and cell compromise, even from life experiences, is an important thing.
So now, I guess the hopeful thing about that is, after cell death and cell compromise, is that we can work on stimulating particular areas of the brain or particular new learnings to try to grow those areas back up. Would that be a simple way to describe it?
Yes, there are many therapies that involve learning new pathways in adaptive kinds of ways. following damage due to things like stroke, where people can be trained to use a limb that they have little function in initially, but if they're forced to use the limb, then they may acquire much better function with it, whereas if they don't use that limb that's been affected by the stroke, then they may totally lose function in it. One exciting thing in brain-computer interfaces is the fact that it's clear in some injuries, like spinal cord injuries, that not all of the neurons have been cut by the injury. Maybe in some cases 85% of the neurons have been cut. And the operation of the remaining 15% is not enough for the person to walk. But if there was electrical stimulation going on and they didn't stop walking but continued moving, those remaining 15% might grow more connections and ultimately allow some ability to walk. But you have to have the therapeutic intervention, both in using the dysfunctional part of the body and maybe some sort of stimulation to get that to work. So that's an important thing for, I think, therapists to think about is trying to rehabilitate by getting people to operate in some normal manner and enhancing what little capability is left after some injury.
Yeah, that's a nice thought about kind of people helping them along, doing the best they can with the limitation, and then imagining that stimulation helping it to grow and to recover as much as possible back to some closer sense of normalcy. That's probably a lot of what we do with emotion-based therapy as well, as something along those lines. That's really fascinating. So that kind of ties us, I don't know, brings us back a little bit to the whole nervous system when you start talking about spinal cord injury. And I'm thinking of some family members that I have spinal cord injury and are trying to spend hours a day moving, moving legs, even though there's no walking happening, just to try to keep that ready and able in case there are more breakthroughs in the science.
Actually, I can tell you a story that's kind of interesting. I went to a conference a few years ago sponsored by the NIH on brain-computer interfaces, and one of the keynote speakers was a quadriplegic who had been injured in a motorcycle accident, and he woke up in an iron lung, not even being able to breathe. And the guy was a smart guy, and he managed to do some reading and found out that there were surgeons who could implant a diaphragm pacemaker. So he got one of these implanted, and this was actually a fairly straightforward prosthetic device that electrically stimulated him to breathe. And it got him out of the iron lung and out of a $12,000 a month hospital room to just needing an assistant, and he could sort of be pushed around in a wheelchair, and then he could talk and so forth. And the question was immediately asked, well, aren't you terrified that the battery will run out in your diaphragm pacemaker and you aren't in the iron lung and you'll just die? And he said, actually, what happened was that after the stimulation from the pacemaker had occurred for a couple of months, he actually could breathe for a while on his own, several hours, not indefinitely, but certainly long enough to change the battery out in his pacemaker. So with a simple prosthetic device, the whole quality of his life changed, and he was the keynote speaker in this conference and so forth. So these kind of therapeutic interventions with a little bit of technology have a lot of promise in them.
That's so good to hear those kinds of stories. That's really really a happy kind of thought. You wonder about the wherewithal of a person like that to have the stamina and the courage to kind of face that on a daily basis and keep moving forward, you know, like what was in that support system, or what was in that person's makeup that helped them to face the challenge that way.
Yeah, you're exactly right, because for every one success story like his, I'm sure there's 100 other people who didn't have that, who didn't find out that they could be helped and so forth. So, you know, we would like to make these devices more well-known and you know, cheaper to install and all those things. And this is a time in neuroscience when I think more of these things are going to start to happen. So it's an exciting time to be involved in neuroscience, and in which technological improvements, I think, will really benefit people's lives.
Yeah. So I want to come back just to a minute to your lab and your retinal studies, the ganglion cell project, I think, that you're working on. Is that, am I in the right range?
Yeah, I studied retinal ganglion cells.
How does that practically, you know, what does that look like on a day-to-day basis? What kind of equipment are you using? What does that look like?
Well, I record from the eyes of various kinds of laboratory animals with little microelectrodes, and I record their responses to various kinds of light patterns to determine, you know, which ones respond to movement or colors or edges and those kinds of things. The experiments I do sort of last about 8 hours or so. I do a couple of those a week, and you know, hopefully soon I will be able to raise some funds to start stimulating artificially some of these cells, and if I can find an appropriate animal model where there's a photoreceptor degeneration, see if I can make the animals be able to see again with the stimulation, and then translate that ultimately to people who've had photoreceptor degeneration. So that's where I'm heading. You know, we'll see how long it takes to get there and so forth, but that's what I'm trying to do.
Well, you've been very successful in getting funding for your research across your career, and it's such important work that you're doing. You started with virtual intelligence, I think, didn't you, somewhere in there? Is this somehow going to culminate? I mean, it sounds like they're interfaced somewhat with what you're doing now and where you're headed.
Well, I did go through brain models and artificial intelligence. We're just getting to the point where computer power is large enough that computers can solve some problems that only biological systems were able to solve. One thing I can think of, for example, is that DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, used to sponsor an autonomous car race in the western desert somewhere. And until a few years ago, you know, the typical one of these races, there'd be 30 entries from, you know, MIT and Carnegie Mellon and all these prestigious places, and not a single car ever finished the course. But now with Google and some of these other companies, there are autonomous vehicles, and it's based on the rapid increase in computer power that, among other things, this computer power can solve vision problems that you know, only animal brains were capable of doing until about 10 years ago. So in some cases, these systems are partly based on the way biological systems work. In some cases that they're not, but the increase in computer power is going to enable lots of things with brain-computer interfaces to be much better and much easier to use and much more available to people.
You have likened across some of your writings the similarity between the brain as a computer and computers, and often said that computers just don't have the kind of power that our brains do. But how exciting it is that as computers get better, as we're able to do more, that it can be more likely to, I guess, help us with some of these interfaces. So that's pretty exciting as we figure out more in the computer world.
You know, if you think about the advances in cell phone technology, and most of us, you know, are so dependent on our cell phones that they're almost like they're implanted. They're not quite, but you could see, instead of having to pick the thing up, having a little chip in your head where you would think about the number you wanted to call, and it would call, and you might be able to hear the conversation directly in your head while you're doing other things. I mean, I don't think we're necessarily that far away from that sort of thing.
I would like that. I know many of us are really technology. Of course, there's always that rub between personal contact and technology. I saw a cartoon the other day. It had the current picture of people on their phones, on their iPads, on their phones, sitting around not talking to each other. But then it had this flashback to 50 years ago when people were sitting behind their newspapers, you know, and I thought, oh, I like that so well, because just because we're using technology gadgets doesn't mean we're less connected maybe than we've been historically, but who knows?
Yeah, there's still a question of being polite and living in the present and all that, and you know, and it's a good idea to put up the cell phone one way or the other for the sake of the people around you, and that will be true even if the chips are implanted. You still need to turn that off and deal with the people around you. So, yeah, it's all the same. The technology just changes. Yeah.
That's right. The ways that we access information are a little bit different now. But we still have to use our good politeness, as you describe, to stay connected to people who are sitting right across from us. But you know, this wouldn't be happening today without some of the advances in technology. Where I here in Vienna, you know, across the world, being able to chat with you, you know, it's just so fascinating and exciting to me. And the things that you're being able to consider doing and are doing based on some of the technology advances, with the vision improvement. That's for someone who suffers with very bad eyesight. The work that you're doing is very exciting because it can be so debilitating to be without vision.
People, it's the second most dreaded thing, going blind. Only cancer, only getting cancer is actually more dreaded.
And with all of the improvements in cancer, you know, I don't think it shocks, and I haven't seen the newest research, but from people that I know who get diagnosis now, it's not the immediate death sentence that it used to be, so that's kind of shifting, I think, as time goes on. Evelyn says that she's heard, that she saw an article about a company who's describing implanting a chip when someone is born. The company must not be an American company doing that with their employees now. It must be an ID chip. I don't know what that would be.
Yeah, people are thinking about those things, and it's coming. The ID chips are passive, of course, and they if you were kidnapped or something, it you know, might help identify. But we're getting better at you know, we've had some people who are quadriplegics who've had chips implanted so they could operate a computer and things like that at Brown University and other places. So there are people working on that part.
Yes. So we've strayed a little bit from some of the neuroscience and artificial intelligence and chips, but I think it's really cool the way that they all interface together, and it seems to interface a little bit in your lab with where your projections are, where you hope you can go. And certainly you've come so far in your research across your career. It's what a fascinating career that you've had, Dr. Amthor, and the way that you've impacted so many students, and of course now the general public with both of your books being come out just in the last few years. It's been very, very delightful to have you share your knowledge with us, your expertise with us in a way that helps it be manageable.
Well, I appreciate that very much. It's been enjoyable and a lot of work, but there's more work to be done, and I'm looking forward to continuing doing it.
So let me just ask you something about the book writing, because I think I heard another interview that you did where you described that you were writing a science fiction book, not a nonfiction book, and somehow that turned into these two recent For Dummy books. Can you describe that to us? And are you still doing science fiction writing?
I did write a science fiction book called The Phoenix War, kind of as a test of whether I wanted to write a book. It was published by a publisher called Sam's Dot Publishing. I think it might be available on Amazon, I'm not sure. It was fun to do. I set a target of writing about 1,000 words a day, and I was able to meet that. I actually wrote that book before I wrote the first of the Dummies books, but then I got the contract to do the first Dummies book, and I kind of put that aside and did the Dummies book. And that took about 9 months to write, and they have a very precise schedule that they put you on, which you write a chapter about every 8 or 9 days, and then during that time you're usually fixing their corrections, the last 2 chapters that you wrote. So it's and you get a lot of help from their production editors who are really, really good. And Dummies likes you to write in a certain style and so forth. So it was very difficult but very enjoyable. Basically, I had no nights and weekends while I was doing those 2 books while I was writing them. So it was quite challenging, but I was happy the way that they came out. So I'm spending a little more time now writing journal articles and things like that in association with my actual research. But I plan to write a few more books. Not exactly sure what will come out next, but it's all in the mix one way or the other.
Well, you've been a prolific author of journal articles, and then to have these books is very, what a nice thing to have on top of it. But it does sound like what a rigorous schedule that was in doing those books that way.
Good for my brain, though. It's good hard novel work. Mm-hmm. So writing a book is very different than the style in a journal article. So maybe I grew a few more neurons in my hippocampus when I did that.
It is so different, isn't it, than a journal article to write a book for the general public. And it's quite a hard thing to do. So it's good that they had that extra support for you to do.
Their production editors are fantastic.
Before we sign off here, I just want to say something to our listeners about what's coming up next month, and I'm going to put a little link in the chat box for those of you who are interested. Ian Kerner is coming on, and he is going to be talking about sexual health and gender differences in sexual health. So we're going from the brain directly to the other excitement system in the body. So I've given you that link. He's a New York Times best-selling author and a sex and relationship expert. So I just want to put a little plug in for that. And Dr. Amthor, just one final thing. If you had, based on, your work with the general public, the books that you've written to talk both about the neurobiology and the neuroscience, I think kind of leaned more on the neuroscience today because I'm so interested in the systems of that myself. What kind of tips would you have for us around, helping others and helping ourselves in relation to our taking good care of our brains? We've talked about all of them, but maybe you talked about some, but maybe you have some parting advice for us.
Well, I think, besides just taking care of your body and, maintaining your weight and being physically active, I think living in the present, as a Buddhist would say, and paying attention to what's around you and really trying to interact with people and not just on your cell phone are things that keep your brain healthy and challenged. At any time in one's life, there are people around you that you can help, that need input from you, that you can interact with, that you can learn from, and continuing to do those things are what keep your brain young and you young and keep everything healthy. So I think those things are great to do, and it makes life more enjoyable also.
Thank you so much, Dr. Amthor. It's just been delightful to have you on, and to I think my big takeaway here is about the excitement in the cells, and the overexcitement leading to depletion and harm, and the importance of that regulation, and also, of course, the hope in being able to reconstruct and how powerful the brain is and being able to regenerate. So thank you so much for being on with us. I really appreciate your time and you sharing your expertise with us and so many.
Thank you, Dr. Jorgensen. I enjoyed it very much. Have a good day.
Okay. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Okay. Bye-bye.